Hi and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here today, and in this video I'll be sharing with you how I painted this hillside full of abstract flowers under a silvery full moon. I'm beginning with my paper taped onto my board and laid down flat. I'm using Arch brand watercolour paper today, rough grain, and you can see I've done a quick pencil outline of the hills, and I'm going to be using some Pebeo drawing gum to just spatter a handful of stars into the sky. So I'm using a mid-sized round brush and gently just tapping it with my forefinger after dipping it into the masking fluid and getting a few random spatters across that top part of the paper. This is just a slightly more controlled method than I usually do with my fan brush. This just gives us a little bit extra control over where those stars fall. However, if you do get some falling into the lower part of the paper, wait until the masking fluid is dry and then you can easily rub them off with your fingertip. Once the masking fluid is dry, we're ready to paint. I'm beginning today with the sky, and I'm using a large 2-inch wash brush to put a layer of clean water onto my paper. I'm trying to follow the pencil line that I've drawn on previously, just following that line of the hillside and concentrating on getting enough water onto that sky to be able to get a really nice graduated wash. I'm going to be using indigo today for my night sky and for quite a lot of the painting as well, in fact. But if you don't have indigo or prefer other colours, then of course use those instead. Sometimes you can get a lovely night sky using a mix of ultramarine and Payne's grey, for example, just those lovely sort of deep, rich blue tones. Now, I don't want this sky to be too flat. I want a little bit of brightness in it because we're going to be putting a beautiful full moon onto one side. So I'm just switching over to a smaller brush, which is going to give me a little more control. And I'm layering in some richer paint along the top and then beginning to bring it down towards the brow of the hill in a really nice, simple, graduated wash. So what I'm aiming for is a nice glow of moonlight drifting across the top of the hill. So I'm trying to keep the paint here quite light and relatively pale and just soften that rich paint down into this slightly more watery section and get a nice sort of graduation of colour from light to dark going upwards. And now I'm going to use the coin trick or hack to create the full moon. All you need is a small coin and some tissue. I'm using a 5p piece and I'm just going to wrap it up in my tissue nice and tightly. Give it a little twist at the back and just make sure the tissue is just encapsulating that coin and you've got that nice round shape. And once it's ready, all you need to do is just stamp it in where you want your moon, hold for a couple of seconds, and then lift up and out cleanly. And there we are, that is our lovely circular moon. Now I'm just giving it a little tidy up with a small clean brush just dipped in a little bit of clean water. And if your paint doesn't lift properly, some colours are staining and won't lift entirely with tissue like this, so you do get some darker patches, and you can always tidy them up a little bit with a small brush and some clean water. And now, whilst the sky is still wet, I'm going to add in some distant trees along the brow of this hill. And you can see I'm doing that quite simply by using my small brush and some rich indigo paint, and I'm just dabbing it along the line of this hill and allowing the paint to diffuse upwards into that water that's still there in the sky. The water is just carrying the paint upwards, letting it bloom out and give the impression of some really lovely distant trees there. So whilst that's drying, I'm going to work along the bottom part of the paper now and start bringing together this hillside. I know this looks quite strappy at the moment. I'm basically just getting a bit of water and a bit of paint into the hillside just to give me the correct shape. I decided to leave this top section white for the time being in order to do a little dry brushing on it later. For now I'm focusing on getting paint and water sort of sweeping up and across and creating this sweeping foreground here, which is where we're going to put in our flowers. Now you can see that I'm using my larger flat 2-inch brush here just to get the water and get the paint on the paper really nice and quickly. The large brush gives you great coverage and allows you to get that water on nice and speedily. However, I am switching back to my smaller brush to start bringing together the sort of shape and the texture of this hillside. This is a 3/4 inch top mop brush from Willow Wolf's Talia range. Really, really nice brush. As you can see, I'm able to get lots of paint onto it, and I'm actually really layering the paint up quite thickly here, creating these sort of ridges along the hillside of darker paint. This is because I'm going to pop some salt on to create our beautiful meadow flowers, and I think it works really, really well on rich paint. Now, whilst you could certainly turn this into a monochrome painting and stick with purely using indigo, I've decided to mix it up a little bit with some ultramarine pink. And that's just going to form a base for our little bloom of flowers across this hillside. And you can see that I'm following this curve that I've created with the indigo and just sort of reinforcing that sort of ridge line on this hillside. And just quickly pulling up a little bit of darker paint to create a little stand of trees here. I've switched to an even smaller brush. This is a size 4 round, and you can see I am literally just pulling the colour up out of the hillside and into the sky just to create these really, really loose tree shapes. And all I'm doing is just making marks that are diffusing now into the sky, which is still a little wet in this area, which is really, really helpful, and just get the impression here of a distant stand of trees disappearing across the ridge down there on the right. You'll notice that I'm also leaving some of the white of the paper peeking through this tree line, just because I really like the effect. I get that sort of glint of light coming through the trees, that slight hint of moonlight coming through those sort of tree trunks and drifting across the hillside. So now that our trees are done, I'm going to begin adding salt to this painting to get our lovely bloom effects. So I'm going to start along this top line here where the paint is slightly drier. So I'm just following the curve that I've made with my brush and adding in a really light little sprinkle of salt along this top line. You can see that towards the bottom of the paper, you can see that there, that paint is still really, really wet. And if I put the salt on now, it probably won't do much except make a mess. So I'm just going to leave that for a minute to dry a little more. And now you can see I have left it for a few minutes. That salt that I put on the top is already starting to work. I hope you can see that. So now I'm just going to follow the same line, following this sort of rich paint, this rich ultramarine pink and indigo that I've got going across the hillside, and just following it with the salt, and then sitting back and crossing my fingers. And this is how it looked after 10 minutes. You can see that salt really starting to take effect and work beautifully in the rich paint. And this is how it turned out once it dried. Isn't that incredible? This is one of the reasons I love working with salt and watercolour. You never quite know exactly the effects you're going to get. I suspect that because I layered up quite a lot of water and paint on this painting, which caused the paper to buckle a little and create a directionality, that was the direction the salt flowed in and pulled the paint from, which is why we've got these long, sort of tall standing effects that look to my mind like lupins or hollyhocks or some kind of beautiful tall standing flowers, as opposed to these smaller little bits that I've got down here on the right hand side. This is more like what I was expecting. But it's all to the good. I think it looks wonderful, and I really don't think there's too much that needs to be done now to this painting. So I'm going to put in a little bit of careful dry brush along this top here. One of the reasons that I left this clear was because I was on the fence about turning this into a snow scene when I began, and of course I thought a lovely white ridge of snow would look wonderful against a hillside full of flowers, and then I realised that you were unlikely to get a hillside full of summer flowers in the snow, so we are just going to add in a little bit of dry brushing across here to just give us a little bit of detail. And I actually ended up coming back in a bit later on in the painting and darkening this down and turning this into an extension of this field of flowers, sort of like a distant meadow, if you will. Now, I think this actually really handily illustrates one of the wonderful things about painting with watercolour is that sometimes, quite often actually, what you end up with on the paper isn't a perfect translation of the image you have in your head or in your sketchbook of what you want to paint, and that's okay. You know, it's important to be adaptable, I think, and I certainly wasn't expecting these tall and magnificent salt blooms to appear, but here they are. And so I'm going to work my painting around them and still hopefully create something beautiful. Now with these delicate little blooms down here, these little salt freckles, I'm using my sword liner brush, which has got a really thin fine point to it, and I'm just doing some really fine lines coming down and creating essentially stalks and turning these into flowers. And again, coming back to what I was saying about being adaptable with your painting, this is what I had planned to do for the flowers across the entire hillside. I had in my head the image of these delicate, dainty little sprinkles of salt, and you can easily, as you can see here, just pop some random sort of lines underneath them that becomes plant stems and turns them into the prettiest little delicate abstract flowers. This clearly is not going to work now, but that's fine. We can still do it down here on this right hand side, and the fact that we've got this little delicate clump of flowers here that I'm enhancing with some leaves and stalks actually helps to sort of coalesce the impression of the rest of this slightly wild salt blooms, and that sort of impressionistic flower helps to draw the eye and make the viewer think, ah yes, well these are flowers, so those ones must be as well. So it's a handy little trick there, I think. And of course, now that the backdrop is dry, you can use your thinner brush to enhance those distant trees a little bit and add in some thinner branches and some darker lines. Now I'm just going to enhance this tree line a little bit further by using some opaque white gouache. Now this is of course entirely optional. I know some people prefer not to use it in their paintings, but for me this tree line ended up just being a little bit dark, so as you can see I'm just using again just the tip of the sword liner and pulling in some extra pale branches and pale thin trunks into these trees. I liked the extra impression of light that this gives, and perhaps as well this is including some of those beautiful silver birch trees in this little patch of forest here. And I love silver birches. I love how their sort of crinkly white bark turns to silver in the moonlight. Now I'm just using again the white gouache to add some little paler lines, some little paler highlights around the stalks of these delicate flowers down here on the right. Now this will dry slightly darker than you're seeing it here because the gouache at this point is a little watered down, a little runny, so it is going to dry not quite so bright white. So this is just a nice little touch you can do to add a bit of extra detail and a little bit of extra texture down in this little clump of flowers here. And of course, don't forget your starry sky. Don't forget to rub off the masking fluid that we spattered on right at the start of the painting to create some lovely stars. You can see I'm easily just rubbing off these tiny little dots of masking fluid with my finger, and we're getting a beautiful sky full of stars. However, if you want more stars, if you're not happy with what you've ended up with, now you've got the paint on, white gouache is your friend as well here, and this time just using the fan brush to delicately spatter a little extra sprinkling of stars into the sky. And I'm also going to use it down here among the lower part of the flowers just to give a little bit of extra detail, a little bit of extra life. And you can see I'm actually trying to be very careful and not spattering very heavily, keeping the drops really, really small and light. And now for a touch of magic. I've mixed some permanent yellow with my white gouache to make it opaque, and now I'm just going along the line of these flowers and spattering little tiny clouds of these opaque, lovely bright yellow droplets across, which are going to stand up and stay yellow against the darkness of these darker colours thanks to the white gouache. And I think it looks like clouds of beautiful fireflies drifting amongst these blooms, lighting the place up, giving a lovely sort of glint of brightness amongst these darker colours, these rich dark hills here. And I just love this effect, partly because I've always loved fireflies. I think they're so beautiful and magical, and I love that something as simple as this can create this effect in a painting. And now here I am just adding a little bit of extra dark colour into my dry brushing along the top ridge of this hill here. And that's nice and simple. I'm just using my mop brush and some dark paint, not too watery, and just trying to be quite delicate and quite lightly just scuffing over the textured paper here. I'm using rough grain paper here, which makes dry brushing really, really nice. And I think it also did contribute towards how well the salt worked as well, because the little salt grains were able to get into that sort of really roughly textured paper and worked their magic for me. So this is the final finishing touch to this painting. So here we are with the finished painting. I'm really pleased with how this one turned out. It did end up being a little different from my initial vision, but I'm delighted with it nonetheless. Hopefully this will inspire some of you to go and take your salt pot out of the kitchen and into the studio to play with some of these kind of salt effects. But a big thank you to everybody for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you've got any questions or comments, please pop them below and I'll do my best to answer. If you'd like to see any more videos from me, then I do have a Patreon page that you can sign up for. Just follow the link below and it'll take you straight there. But that's all from me this week. Thank you everybody so much for watching. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day and happy painting.